Hello, and welcome to the second segment of three short presentations on the theme of forgiveness, the gift that keeps on giving. I've entitled this second segment, Forgiveness Becomes Us. I'd like to begin this second segment with a little story. Rachel lay in a hospital bed in her dining room as two elderly brothers sat at the dining room table talking quietly. One was a priest, and the other the husband of Rachel. The priest was worried about his brother, who had become Rachel's primary caretaker, and he himself had significant health issues. He looked over at his sister-in-law and mentally lamented the deterioration in her appearance since she had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Once an elegant lady, she had now become too thin, disheveled, often confused and forgetful. Her husband, seeing the priest's gaze, following his brother's gaze, leaned over and said to the priest, "Isn't she beautiful?" One imagines that the husband's viewpoint had been developed over a lifetime of practiced forgiveness and acceptance. And this is true not because Rachel was particularly in need of forgiveness for many sins, but because loving forgiveness is what enables us to really see the goodness of others, the human worth of others. Forgiveness frees us to see and to act with an altogether different skill set than what may be readily apparent to the naked eye. In a very real way, forgiveness provides an indispensable lens for seeing people, including ourselves, as we really are, vulnerable and grand, imperfect, yet capable of attracting others to truth, beauty, and goodness. In English, as in other languages, forgiveness is a compound word, for and give. In German, it's vergeben. In French, pardonner. Forgiveness is first of all a gift. It is given on behalf of or for another, one who cannot or will not yet give for whatever reason. Forgiveness means someone gives first. It is grace, and often it can only be accomplished because of prayer. We have to describe, not define forgiveness, because forgiveness is inherently unlimited. It seeks to stretch us and expand our purpose, to tap into our charity and compassion, to enable us to hear, to really listen to, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, the better angels of our nature, which will restore, he promised, the bonds of affection we have for one another. There are benefits to forgiveness. It relaxes our face, soothes the brow, gives a lightness to our step. In a sense, forgiveness becomes us. Forgiveness enhances our humanity. With its accent on the gift, forgiveness practices generosity. It curbs our natural instinct toward retaliation and vengeance and instead improves us, playing to our strengths rather than our weaknesses. In probably his most well-known book, The Wounded Healer, theologian Henry Nouwen challenges his readers: how can we heal ourselves if we have not wrestled with healing? How can we heal others if we have not wrestled with healing ourselves. If we know we have been forgiven, how can we not forgive others? Forgiveness, now one says, is the way to freedom. The novelist Henry James famously advised his young nephew as he set off to go to school for the first grade, the first time. 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. The third is to be kind. Again, the Bible can help us ponder the beautiful depths of forgiveness. Let's review the story of Saul and David found in the 1st and 2nd book of Samuel that summarize the early history of Israel's kings. The well-known, well-loved story of Saul and David perfectly illustrates the importance of the gift of forgiveness, its power, its range, and its effects. There are many similarities between the 2 future kings at the start. Both are handsome, popular, successful in battles. Both have political skills making them attractive to the crowds. Yet both also had a darker side that drew on their ambitions, cunning, and calculating tendencies to find ways to use and abuse others for their own ends. From the beginning, the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel seems to show a consistent bias against Saul, the first king, and for David, his successor. For the biblical historian who wrote these books, 1 and 2 Samuel, the covenant is the fundamental truth. Kings were judged as good or evil on the basis of their faithfulness to the covenant, initiated and consistently reiterated by God. The biblical writer portrays Saul as not compliant with the covenant, whereas David was obedient to it. So while both kings demonstrate spectacular human failings, Saul is judged more harshly than David. One of the principal reasons for this is that Saul seemed to know little about forgiveness, either accepted or extended. David, on the contrary, is humbled by being forgiven much and passes it on to others. Saul demonstrated uncontrolled self-will, for example, as he confronted some of Israel's enemies. But Saul began to do his own thing. Although he half-heartedly listened to the prophet and admitted guilt when confronted, he did not sincerely repent or change the course of his conduct. He chafed at being told what to do or at limiting his power. He vowed to kill his own people, even his sons, if they got in his way. Saul repeatedly disobeyed the prophet, and the Bible indicates that the Spirit of God left him and his heart was not shalom. From then on, we can see Saul's descent into a kind of soul sickness that eventually contributed to his death after he was alienated from the prophet, from his own children, and especially from his divinely appointed successor, David. When we compare their transgressions, it might seem that David's were as bad or even worse than Saul's. David used every form of chicanery to get what he wanted. He married Saul's daughter and then betrayed her in his lust for Bathsheba. David had Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, killed and took her for himself. That seems like an abuse of power far beyond what Saul had done. But the great difference between Saul and David is that Saul continued to resist the Spirit of God, while David repeatedly accepted God's way of doing things, a way much more magnanimous than human beings would naturally have been inclined to choose, a way that has everything to do with forgiveness. When confronted by the parable that Nathan the prophet addressed to him, David got it. David came to understand the extent of his misdeeds and his influence for good or evil. David heard the prophet's accusation, "You are the man, the one who mercilessly stole from the poor for his own enrichment and gratification." David showed remorse, accepted judgment, fasted and prayed, and his heart was open to accept forgiveness so that he could grow from the experience and pass it on to others. Traditionally, David is known as the writer of the Psalms, and although the history of the composition of the Psalms is more complicated than just that David wrote them out, we can profit from understanding the universal human experience expressed in the Psalms as examples of people who were trying to do the right thing. We can imagine that as David pondered Nathan's parable and accepted his own culpability, he could have been inspired to compose Psalm 51, for example, saying, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me." Saul's refusal to follow God's Spirit led him to disobedience, jealousy, depression, and restlessness. Saul simply could not forgive David's popularity and talents because he was consumed with fear and jealousy. David, on the other hand, recognizing his own sinfulness and limitations, repeatedly forgave Saul. Saul tried relentlessly to kill David or have him killed, but these efforts failed. On several occasions, David could have killed Saul. But despite David's obvious character flaws, he respected Saul's rule as king and forgave even Saul's murderous intentions. Finally, after Saul died a victim of his own worst impulses, David sought out his survivors. He tracked down Saul's grandson, who was crippled, and told him, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." And so it was. Forgiveness enabled David to abandon revenge, to be graceful and kind, to be generous because God had so abundantly blessed him. The lives of Saul and David illustrate the implications of Moses' challenge to the people as they stood poised to enter the promised land. Moses says, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him." We search in vain to find a story or law or lesson in the Bible that validates always being right and self-justified. We cannot find in the Bible examples of perfect people. What we do find there are forgiven people asking for acceptance, for redemption, and grace. As a teacher for many years, I have learned much from my students. One story that made a profound impression on me was the following, and I've entitled it, "Those Given to Us." 2 a.m., phones rang in 3 different households, the call that every parent dreads. Unbeknownst to them, the children of all 3 households, friends since middle school, had gone 100 miles away to celebrate their high school graduation. They were underage. They had been drinking. There was a 1-car accident. The driver, slightly injured, was in the hospital, but would soon be arrested. 1 child died. Another was badly hurt. 6 parents drove through the darkness, anxious, fearful, and grief-stricken. The young men felt guilty, afraid, sorry beyond words. Each wondered how he or she would be received by the others. The parents braced themselves for potential blame and guilt. In the waiting room that night, and in other waiting rooms and courtrooms, the grieving families searched for anything that they could do for one another. They brought sandwiches, fetched soft drinks, prayed quietly as they held hands or embraced. One parent spoke of the power of seeing this sorrowing group like those disciples who stood at the foot of the cross, struggling to bring meaning out of the tragedy that they witnessed as participants. My student who was telling me about this experience said, "I saw us as given to one another." Just as Jesus had said to his mother, "Behold your son," and to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother," we became a community in our sorrow. We ministered to each other. Anything that seemed to make us different from one another faded away, and we were one in our brokenness, one in our hope. We truly were given to one another. John's gospel is unique in a number of ways. One is that instead of saying anywhere that Jesus demanded of his followers that they love their neighbor or that they love their enemy, Jesus simply says, "Love one another." In fact, there is a legend promulgated by St. Jerome that the Apostle John, who is sometimes identified also as the mysterious beloved disciple, referred to near the end of the gospel, that John, late in his life, when asked what was required of Jesus' followers, kept repeating, "Little children, love one another." Some of his disciples became annoyed at this apparent oversimplification of and responded asking him if there was not something more complicated expected of them. John is said to have replied once again, "Love one another. Do this and it is sufficient. This is the sum of the gospel." The point, or one of them it seems, is that forgiveness, repeated and without limit, is an essential component of love. When we love others nearest to us, those who people our lives, our family, our friends, co-workers, and religious community, we are engaged in spreading the gospel. This is the sum and essence of Jesus' preaching. In a sense, it may be easier to love those who are far away, who don't really make everyday demands on our lives and our time and our energy. But it is the never-ending requests of our spouses and colleagues, children, and fellow parishioners, our co-workers and neighbors, parents, and dependents of all kinds that really stretch us, that call out our love and our kindness and invoke the better angels of our nature to come to our aid on a daily basis. No one who knows the Gospels can think of forgiveness without conjuring Luke's story of the woman who loved much, who entered the house of the self-righteous Pharisee Simon and showed him and us what forgiveness means and how it empowers. It appears that this unnamed woman had already encountered Jesus, and Luke insinuates that that encounter transformed her. She literally took her life into her own hands by showing up this way. No woman, not even a virtuous one, much less, as Luke says, one known to be a sinner, could appear at the meal while the men ate and do what she is said to have done: bring an alabaster jar of ointment, wash Jesus' feet with her tears, dry them with her long, loose hair, massage them with costly lotion, and kiss them. Least of all could she do this with impunity at the home of a Pharisee, a member of a sect that, more than anything, as their name suggests, prides them as being people set apart, as if removed from regular humanity. For more reasons than one, she would have seemed to be at the lower end of humanity, while the host that day was part of the upper echelon. Simon the Pharisee must have had to do violence to himself to restrain his outrage, not only at the woman, but at Jesus, as he wondered, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what manner of woman is touching him, that she is a sinner. The irony is that it is a fundamental tenet of Judaism that all are sinners. Yet apparently Pharisees, or at least this Pharisee, truly believed at that moment that he was different, somehow really set apart, and without the usual human limitation and unworthiness that is at the core of most religions, and especially Judaism. As Barbara Reed would point out, the most important verse of this whole story is Jesus' question to Simon, "Do you see this woman?" We do well to seek the grace to see as Jesus does, not only ourselves, but to see others. In conclusion, as we grow in the spiritual life, we might ask ourselves, how do we want to be known or remembered? What epitaph would be written of us? What stories of compassion and understanding of the human condition could our own good friends remember us by? I would like to be able to see as Rachel's husband does, because he loves much. I would like to be in the company of Lincoln, Nouwen, and Henry James, and maybe David, but not Saul or the Pharisee Simon, who failed to see as Jesus did. I want to commit to heart the theme of the elderly Apostle John, who went about saying, "Little children, love one another." The pastor where I worship is well known for bringing into virtually every homily a reminder that we should recognize who and whose we are. He repeats so consistently how this works that the community can almost say in unison what we hear each week in one way or another. We are favored and loved, healed, graced, blessed, forgiven. These are convictions worth becoming famous for. Forgiveness has no limits. It is the gift that keeps on giving, demanding, and rewarding. Forgiveness lifts us up. It elevates us and brings out the best in us. Forgiveness becomes us.